one knows him not just as an architect, but if you go to any gallery, you will have at least one or two people who will come over and say, so he's the mentor, and I'm very glad that I'm going to give a presentation because my mentor is sitting right here. So he's an architect and also a very well-renowned teacher, I must say. Katie is currently serving as the Dean Emeritus at RICS School of Built Environment and is also the advisor of the UN Capital Master Plan of New York. I'm very sorry his title of the paper is wrongly written in the itinerary. The correct title is Climate in Response to Urban Design, Approaches of the Vernacular.
Technology is getting sorted. I'll just start up with the introductory part of what I was going to say. I'm going to take you away from the building as an artifact and move to the city. In urban design, every building is a brick with which the city is built. Every building, its character, its nature, and the way the buildings come together and the social and public spaces they create, that is invaluable expression of our culture. And city is a very complex mechanism, and we have progressively moved away from all our learned principles, and through a kind of almost 100 years of indoctrination, we have forgotten and much of the traditions of city building that our country has enjoyed, and we have moved faster and faster towards a globalized glass box, which we know very well is completely unsustainable in our conditions. And we have also moved to a city structure which is dominated by the automobile and dominated by kind of ideas of public spaces which are inherited from the European Renaissance. For a long time, the education in India, urban design education also in India, has been completely dominated by the traditions generated in the European Renaissance movement, where we learned about spaces and actuality and publicness and so on, purely as translated from the European Renaissance. Whereas we have hundreds of traditional cities in this country. We have, for instance, except for Chandigarh and Naya Raipur and Gandhinagar, I think every other city has a traditional city core in it. Every city has a traditional part and a modern part of the city. And these traditions of building cities, these traditions of actually bringing people together in a certain social structure has been a tradition that we have forgotten, and it has not been taught in schools of architecture for a very long period of time, and we have progressively moved towards an unsustainable form, which we know there is no future in that direction. We know today that Europe is overbuilt, their populations are dropping, and they have to invent projects to make them happen. And they don't have that natural growth impetus which the Asian cities have. But what are we doing is we are looking at those rarefied models which are developed in the European cities. This is not to run down the European cities. They are beautiful cities. Some of the finest public spaces in the world you can see in Europe. Some of the finest architecture you can see in Europe or in America. This is not to say that they are inferior, but it's like saying that hair is very beautiful on someone's head, but it's despicable in the food. When you take something out of its place and put it into an inappropriate location, it becomes completely unacceptable. This is what is happening to the building of cities in this country. And the point that I want to make today is that whatever progressive positions today urban design is taking, and the principles around which those progressive positions are constructed in classrooms and so on, can actually be found in our traditional cities. This is the one simple point that I want to make, and I'll just start off with my presentation. So, what I want to present to you is that how today's major concern about climate change and how cities contribute hugely to that climate change, because we consume so much of resources, we generate so much waste, and the ecological footprint of our cities are not only expanding around in the country, but also, like it was just said now, we're importing timber from Malaysia and Africa and everywhere. We are following the Japanese model, where to wrap a little chocolate, the Japanese will have 5 wrappings, and finally it will come in a beautiful box, and all the materials which are used for wrapping is sourced from another country, the resource of another country. So this is the kind of rarefied objectification and worship of consumption that we are moving towards. And if you talk about Swachhata, for instance, today, it's not just about cleaning. It's also looking at our consumption pattern. It's looking at how we package the material that we use, how much of waste is generated through packaging. When you get a wedding invitation today, it comes wrapped in a plastic sheet. Why should it come in a plastic sheet? It's terrible to touch a plastic sheet. And you're generating more and more waste, you're generating more and more pollution in the environment. So it is towards this reduction of this consumption and a kind of a frugality of approach that we need to move towards. And that frugality can be found in the way we have traditionally dealt with our city structures. This is the point that I would be making. Now, first I want to just place the idea of the climate change, where we have now, traditionally in our cities we are a different mode, but we have now a kind of a linear metabolism in which we consume huge amounts of resources, a disproportionate amount of resources, and then we create a disproportionate amount of waste and pollution. This needs to be redefined into a circular kind of metabolism, and this circular metabolism is also metaphoric expression for we need to recycle our old cities. We need to put our old cities into the circular metabolism, where we reinvent, we rediscover the values and virtues of the vernacular cities that we have in the country. Now, if you look at the current principles of urban design, you will see that there are 7 important parameters which are always quoted as the characteristics of, or the new principles of, a good city design. And first of that is the city form is compact. I think this was also discussed in the morning about the compactness of the city. We saw how compactly the Mohenjo-daro and Harappan structures were built. Second thing is that we have an optimum density. Third thing is that we use mixed use. Fourth thing is that we have pedestrian and non-motorized movement or electrified movement, non-polluting sources of movement. And we have low embodied energy materials. We have streets as social spaces. We have sustainable social network. Now, if you look at all these 7 principles, these are precisely the principles which are being formulated to start the smart city movement in India. So, if these are the principles that we are looking at, my contention is that the old organic city already addresses every one of these 7 principles, these urban design issues, in a very effective manner. Now, I'll go through these 7 points very quickly. I'll be fast, okay? Sorry, I took too much time in the introductory part. Now, closely built compact city has a number of advantages. First thing is that it consumes less land. Land is one of the most precious commodities we have. We are literally destroying our food security by invading the countryside. Housing estates are growing every day more and more into the countryside, more and more into active arable agricultural land. And consumption of land is something that we first need to contain. Consumption in all forms we need to contain, because that's the basic principle of sustainability. What did Gandhiji say when he talked about aparigraha? He was talking about non-possession. And what was his concept of Gram Swaraj? It is about consuming only for your own use and creating only sufficient amount of surplus to be able to barter with someone else to meet your needs that you cannot generate in your own environment. For instance, if you need salt, if you need to buy salt, you have to have something to barter for that salt if you don't produce the salt yourself. This was the principle on which the whole entire concept of Gram Swaraj, which is actually a very, very interesting unexplored concept. It's anarchist in its complete content. It's another discussion, we won't go into it. But main issue is that we reduce consumption. Now, secondly, it reduces the length of infrastructure lines. It has less road, less water and sewage lines, less energy transmission losses. When you compact the city, you build lesser and lesser infrastructure, or you waste lesser money in servicing the same amount of land and same amount of built form. Third is that it's easier to administer and maintain because of its compactness. Fourth is that it creates more chance encounter between people. In other words, it creates more socially sustainable spaces in which people have the opportunity to run into each other. For instance, now if you look at Delhi, we have no place where we can go. You leave your house in a car and you arrive at another place 20 kilometers away in your car, and the city did not exist in between except as a traffic jam. So there is a whole loss of the city that we are now currently experiencing, and that is the cause of the road rage, that's the cause of rape, that's the cause of the kind of aggression that you find in the city. Now the fifth thing, it gives you better access to social infrastructure. Because of the compactness, people are able to access social infrastructure much easier. They can walk to a hospital, they can walk to a school, they can walk to any kind of other amenity that's provided by the city. Then it reduces commuting distance. That's, we use the motor car lesser and less. By mutual shading, the buildings will be more functional in a hot arid condition. It promotes more urbanity. There is some specific virtues in urbanity. It's another discussion altogether. I'm not talking about the suburb where you love your neighbor and so on. This is something else about people becoming more and more urbane. And traditionally, India was a very urbane culture. And it was in the crowded cities of India that all our culture was founded. The finest music comes from our traditional cities. Finest textiles come from traditional cities. Finest pan comes from traditional cities. Finest philosophy comes from traditional cities. Finest artwork comes from there. And some of the finest people come from there. Now, what is it that we are replacing all that intensity with? We are replacing them with unsustainable cities where people are alienated from each other and they are collecting more and more rage. This is what we are replacing it with. So we need to seriously look at how we are designing our cities, and it's important that we look at these lessons from the traditional city point of view. Now the last ninth point is that it promotes intensive use of public spaces. That is, today if you have to go to a public space, you have to find some form of transport to go there, because you have to go to that destination. You cannot encounter that public space in your daily life because the city is not sufficiently compacted. So in a compact city, it generates better and more intensive public use. Now, examples of compact city form is the 18th century city of Jaipur, which was conceived as an urban design exercise in the third dimension, not as a Nila Pila land use plan, but as a thriving city in the third dimension, and which has a vibrant mixed use, is a compact city with complete urban design control that harmonizes the whole city experience. In other words, all the building bylaws and regulative measures that we are talking about today in development authorities is not able to address the issues of creating this kind of intensity of urban living, and Jaipur has successfully demonstrated that in the 18th century itself. I'll show you quickly some images. This is Jodhpur, which is one of the finest example of a compact city, low-rise compact city. The next issue that we are looking at is issue of density, because if you're talking about compact form, you're talking about also compacting people, bringing them together. The image here is the idealized image of a city from Nepal, where you have intense collection of buildings which are founded in valleys in separate group formations, and you have floating in the sky all the centers of spirituality. This is an idealized form of a city, but it shows how buildings are not scattered, they are actually clustered together. And density of form as well as people generate socially desirable and safer environments. When you have more people in a place, you have a safer environment. Most of the crime that you see in cities actually takes place in areas which are abandoned, or which are isolated, non-inhabited, or which are left free, so often without lighting. Those are areas where crimes take place. If you have an intense bazaar, you will see that there is no crime there. There won't even be pickpockets, because if they're caught, they'll be thrashed by the people. So it becomes a place where there is heavy social surveillance when you bring people together. Now, these are some examples of high density form as we find in India. This is images from Madurai, and Madurai is, if you happen to, I don't know how many of you have been to Madurai, but Madurai is a place where I found the most beautiful transporting spiritual experience of being in a temple precinct, because the temple precinct penetrates into the city, and the city penetrates into the temple. So it's a kind of, when you go towards that temple complex, you already begin to feel the urbanity of traditional India, and you can find people sitting just facing a column and singing very beautiful classical music as a form of worship. You can find all kinds of people doing so many different things, but with an intensity that you cannot find anywhere else. And on Thursdays, when people come together in the Madurai temple, you have an experience that you cannot replace anywhere else. You can't find it anywhere else. Of course, there are other beautiful places in India as well. For instance, if you go to Amritsar, at 4 o'clock in the morning, you go to the Golden Temple. You can experience the intensity of what a traditional culture can offer you. And that's the kind of space that we cannot replace. And those are places which we are now progressively destroying and replacing with large, open, hot plazas, which are paved and has parking underneath and so on. The third issue is the issue of mixed use, which is now being once again recognized as an important tool for bringing people together. Through this 50 or 60 years of planning history in India, zoning has totally separated people, separated activities, and separated the city fabric from each other. And now there is an attempt to bring things together. So when you have minimum 3 or more users in one location, it is generally accepted as a mixed use. And mixed use reduces energy consumption for commutation because you can go to work next to your house or in your own house, creates better social mix and improves access to facilities. This whole ceiling drive that happened in Delhi some time back, you might recall, was actually a move against mixed use. And government had to very quickly jump in to save the situation by changing the law, because 80% of the city was involved in it, because that was the natural propensity of people where to work and live in the same place. They don't want to commute to some remote, narrow place type of place to go and work. They'd like to work as closely as to their homes as possible. So here is an image which is from Shahjahanabad, where artisanal communities live inside these houses and they work from their own homes. Of course, I don't mean to say that this is an ideal working condition. It certainly is not an ideal working condition, because these people are not legal in today's terms. If you look at the law, if you look at the bylaw, they are not allowed to work from their own homes. That means they are misusing their premises, because it's a non-conforming use as far as the master plan is concerned. So that is the level to which we have criminalized our own society by looking at zoning, which is brought in from, from 1920s industrial revolution driven suburb of USA and Europe. So there is a mind shift that is required for this. And anyway, however, design typology has to protect the residential environment from excessive outsider penetration. In the traditional building, in the traditional cities, in the traditional fabric, there was social control over the environment. There was visual surveillance by people who lived in the same street. People are very familiar and they're living for long, many years, many generations, and everyone knew each other and there was some kind of social control. In today's contemporary city, that social control is not there. So it is necessary to intervene from building typology perspective, for instance, to separate the entry exits of shops and houses if you are mixing them, so that the women and the children and the old people are safe from the outsiders who will be penetrating into the residential fabric. Then traditional cities also achieve this by design conventions enforced through social control. They had specific things that they could do and they could not do. If you study building typologies in the old cities today, you can see that they had a shop in the front. They had a courtyard from where the material that is sold in the shop was manufactured or parts were assembled, and then you had them living at the back of the house or on top of the shop. So there was an intense mix of manufacture, trade, and living in the same place, and that is now illegal. Now, this is an example from Manali of mixed use. My center of Manali has now been pedestrianized. I just go through these very quickly because I think I am taking a lot of time. And this is the next issue is of pedestrianization and the non-motorized vehicle movement. You can also see our next speaker in this image. He's there in a white t-shirt in his younger days. This is an image from Kathmandu, where it is recognized the world over that the invasion of the automobile needs to be contained or curtailed. Pedestrianization reduces pollution, it increases social encounter, promotes the use of public spaces and landscape. Reduced speed improves design details in building. This is a very important urban design point. When you reduce the speed of a city, you find that people pay more attention to their environment, and in response the environment begins to differentiate itself and become fine-tuned. That's why you find in the traditional cities the shop fronts are so well decorated, or entrance doors of houses are so beautifully articulated, because there was a slow speed, there was encounter between people and their immediate environment. Now that is an opportunity now we have lost, because the higher the speed, you will see that larger the size of the hoarding. That's what you see today. When you go on a highway, you see huge hoardings, because when you are in a high speed movement, you need larger and larger fonts to perceive it. So this is a very important detail, that when you pedestrianize a place, you change the texture of the wall of the city. Then it encourages interactive ground floors. There will be lesser and lesser shutters which are drawn. There will be more and more shutters which are opened. There will be visual penetration of houses and buildings possible, because people will start to interact with the ground floor. Then it promotes hawking, which is the backbone of our cities, because hawking provides very cheap materials for the poorest of this country to use. It's doing an important, very, very important service, that the poorer the people, more they have to rely on what is sold on the road, because they can't afford to pay the taxes, they can't afford to pay for electricity, they can't pay for advertising, they can't afford to pay for rent. So they have to source things from the street, and that's an important service that needs to be done in an Indian city. It creates slowness of movement, and more walking creates more social surveillance. And walking, for instance, improves the health of citizens. I'll be faster. Sorry, I'll just go very quickly. In England, for instance, walking is now perceived as a health measure. So they're promoting more and more walking, because there's more and more obesity. So that's the route we are going to. Let's not forget that that's the route we have chosen. We seem to have chosen, from where we need to revert. I'll move very quickly through all this. So NEV, or electrified personal vehicles, cuts pollution. It saves energy. It's flexible to negotiate narrow roads which are in the old cities. Safe mode for pregnant and old people and handicapped. It encourages small goods movement, which supports small trade. This is a very, very critical point for the Indian city. We need to support the small trader. We need to support the kind of texture of commerce that you see on the streets. Of course, now there is a tendency to have larger and larger stores, and brand names are coming in to buy up larger and larger stores, and that's going to kill the Indian city. It reduces the investment on road infrastructure, because it requires 1/10 the investment of a road to make a pedestrian path. Now, these images are from Cochin and from Delhi. The next issue is that of the low embodied energy materials, which have been largely used in our traditional cities. All materials have their characteristic behaviors, and the behavior yields a construction system that generates the design. In fact, it is the nature of the material and how amenable that material is to what kind of system of design is what actually optimizes the use of that material, and thereby yields a design in the vernacular scenario. Now, traditional materials are often sourced from immediate environment or transported through NMVs. So their embodied energy content is low. Except for burnt brick and metals, all other materials are organic. Shaping and sizing are also by hand and with low mechanical energy. Traditional materials are low energy absorbers and are thermally efficient and easily amenable to repairs and upkeep. That is not so in contemporary materials. If something goes wrong, you simply take it and put it in your garbage bin and you replace it, because there is no other way to deal with them. This is progressively the case of everything that we use. Now, these are just some examples of the traditional materials from different locations. I will not go into details. This is, of course, an image that you just saw with Mr. Bose as well. This is Bapugudi in Wardha, which is the prime example of how low embodied energy materials are used. Gandhiji deliberately moved from Ahmedabad, from Sabarmati to this place to set an example on how India should build. It was in 1936 that he moved out of Ahmedabad and came into this place. Of course, that was in protest to something that happened in Ahmedabad against the mills. because he began sitting on a dharna there in Sabarmati, and then he moved to this place to demonstrate to the country how in the next 100 years we should build. And of course, it's history now that how the invitation of Le Corbusier by Jawaharlal Nehru into the country and the whole trajectory of architecture that is generated, that's another very, very interesting session which I will not go into now. But Gandhi actually did move to this location to demonstrate how low embodied energy and humble materials can actually generate an aesthetically heightened experience. The image that you see here is the place where he used to sit and work. It can't get simpler than this. It's taken down to the bottom level of simplicity. And the moment you reach that place where it becomes so frugal that you can't improve on it, you have created already a heightened aesthetic experience. That is the essence of the kind of architecture that he stood for, and I think Bapu Kuti even today stands for it. These are images from Kerala of buildings which use thatch and bamboo and tile. Again, some images from low embodied energy. What you see on the side, the white thing, is a 16th century church built in Cochin by the Portuguese using wood, lime and stone. And on the other side you have the famous meeting between Gandhiji and Tagore, where Tagore was already experimenting with the vernacular. Tagore actually worked with the Santals and he tried to improve the thatch roof and so on. And he also worked with the musicians who were living around Shantiniketan, and he tried to adapt that music. He tried to imbibe the spirit of vernacular that was being discussed earlier. He tried to bring that spirit into the mainstream life of Shantiniketan, and Gandhi was in dialogue with him on that count. More images of the Portuguese church using vernacular materials and architecture. Now the other next point is that the great Indian street is a type that we cannot forego. We cannot replace that great Indian street. The great Indian street is the place where India's urban culture is actually cooked. It's made pakka on our streets. And the street is the theatre of the Indian city. Often the street functions as a seam between two or more communities by accommodating common facilities, bazaars, possession routes, etc. Streets don't divide communities, they bring them together. You may have two different communities living on either side of the street, but they come together in the street. The street is the seam, not the divider. And the streets are once again under social surveillance by communities and are safe for children. Here you have some images from South India and Rajasthan and Kathmandu and so on. This is an image of the street, use of a static space by a family in Manali. This is again in Kathmandu. One of the most beautiful spaces that you can see in Asia is in Kathmandu. The temple complexes and the spatial articulation of that precinct is something unbelievable. If you have not been to Kathmandu, please go and see this, because it's not only just that the temples as objects of architecture, objectified architecture, is also very beautiful, but the spaces they create are just unbeatable. And here is a compact mixed use and dense cities help social group formations and breed loyalty to the locality. Let's not remember that culture is constructed in localities. When I say locality, I am not talking about only a spatial concept of a locality, but locality is something that's situated within a community. And it is within that interiority that cultural articulation is born. It's consumed in theatres, but it's born in those very private, localized spaces. And we need to protect those spaces if we want to retain what we call Indian culture. This is what you have here is Tulsi Bagh at the bottom, and Tulsi Bagh is a very, very special place in Pune. It's one of the most tranquil spaces that you can see. It has a very old, beautiful temple, And it has all these seats which are built on the side, where the old and the disabled and the men and women and children come and sit on that, and they watch the city go by, coming into the space and going out of the space. Everyone is talking to each other. It's a great social space. And these are spaces that we should actually, we cannot forego these spaces for anything, the best things in the world. These are spaces that we need to protect, because this is where our culture is located. This is the real sense of locality. Now this is on the eve of Eid in Calcutta. This is my last slide. I'm sorry I took a little too long. My contention is, if you can clean up the old organic settlement and wire it, can it then be the new city? This is the question I'd like to leave you with. Thank you very much. Sorry I took too long. Do we have any questions?
Two,
Yeah.
and we'll be quick with it.
We would like to actually have this opportunity because he's an eminent figure in architecture education in India. So please allow us. My question is, sir, we know like the family which eats together, stays together. I'll take it to the urban level. I myself have stayed in Ahmedabad for 2 years, while I was in NID. We have been roaming in the city in the nights. As everybody knows, Ahmedabad is the most safer city still today. Everybody must be knowing about Manik Chowk, that in the older city, older part of the Ahmedabad. That
Until 2 in the morning.
Yeah, exactly. So it keeps bustling with the life. Actually, it transforms into the three major. That place Manik Chowk turns into three major activities. One becomes the shop, and second becomes the evening roaming area. Third becomes the eatery. So my question is, in this, we are currently living in major metros like NCR, Mumbai and all those. Delhi is not a one city. Delhi constitutes today of almost 7 cities: Faridabad, Noida, Greater Noida, Gurgaon, etc. When we cross from one city to the other, like I daily travel from Delhi, New Delhi to Gurgaon, and I come back. So while crossing from one to the other, we do not feel like I am crossing from one place to the another city, or one city to the another city. It has grown actually beyond its limits, actually. So what do you visualize, like our new government is going to establish smart cities in India. So what do you actually visualize, what your inputs will be seeking everything into totality and establishing actually a smart city, not just with the help of 200 kmph cars flashing by from around it, like keeping everything together. What's your visualization?
I don't think it is can be visualized by one person or a government or someone else. It should actually be generated by the way people who live in that city generates their own life. And I can give you in writing that the whole world now wants to move towards more livable environments, and they all reject the kind of environment that we are now trying to create in our cities by increasing the number of cars and providing more flyovers and building over bridges. We are just going crazy. We are doing what was done in Americas in the 50s, and there are many countries where these flyovers are being demolished now. They are trying to bring down the speed of the city, and unless we can bring down the speed of the city, we can't generate that quality of life. And this is well recognized now around the world. And if we are going to make new cities called smart cities, the first thing of being smart is being livable. If it is not livable, you can have the highest technology, the fastest communication, no one is going to come there. I can give you in writing, because people do not have to be in one place to apply technology. They can be sitting on the Himalayas and working. They do not have to come to an office in Gurgaon. So, if you cannot provide quality of life, no one is going to come there. And that is how the idea of the smart city should be articulated, as a livable city. So, it is the livability that we need to seek. Unfortunately, what we are doing now is to hire some international company to write a approach paper on like how should the smart city be, what should be the financial model, how will you recover it. Those are issues, but the manner in which you imagine your finances is going to generate the texture of your city. If your finance is imagined in huge bulks, then your city is going to be like that. You cannot get that fine texture of the Indian city. So, if you want a smart city, you need to think of it as a livable city to begin with, and then you make it smart. You need to make every old city in India to be a smart city. Why not? We have thousands of cities which are traditional cities, which are abused by commerce, which are abused by lack of regulation, which is abused by greed of developers. Why can't we turn them into smart cities as well? We can. We have the wherewithal. We just lack that imagination. So, what I am saying is that if these 7 principles can be applied to the smart city, you will be approximating the smart city to the old city, and meanwhile, you will also be wiring the old city to approximate it to the smart city. So, it is a kind of a perspective that we need to develop about the urbanity of India, which is not vested in how much we can buy from abroad or how much energy we can generate. It is vested in the way we imagine the lives of the people on the street, and that it is that quality that we need to articulate. That is why I am making the comparison between these 2 places. Sorry. Yeah.
So you take advantage of our reluctance.
Well, it's very insightful lecture, and I can relate to most of what you said personally. So like 40-45 years ago, my grandmother, she lived in a haveli in Jaipur, exactly what you showed there. And we would go and often visit her. She was not willing to move out because her whole world actually was there.
That's the sense of locality is so
Yeah.
grounded.
And I can see, so when we visited there, I made more friends there as a visitor than in the suburb in which we live, right? And then these public spaces were wonderful. So every haveli had a little recess space where people play chess, then they gossip about their neighbors who are not there, and so on. It was perfect. But the question is, you see, so my father's generation, for example, they moved out to suburbs. They made their suburb, right, in a very different way than the havelis and bazaars. The question is, they could have duplicated that model. When they run out of space, they can just make more of the same, but they didn't do it. There must be a fundamental reason they didn't do it, which has to do with, you see, the concept of the
Change
private
as progress.
space.
Change
Very
as
European
progress.
concept, personal space, right? Now, I mean, today people actually cannot live there because this European thing about personal space, right, it's not there, right? And so, of course, it creates alienation when you live in suburb, but also alienation in the first place created the suburbs. And this happened after actually British time.
The suburb
It
is
didn't
one of the
happen
most
when the
progressive
British were
moves
here.
you've had.
There was a mall road and a civil lines, but that was not us, right? But so the question is, how did this alienation came in, which then produced this particular model of living, right? So I think change has to come there before actually we can move to this.
And it's still happening. It's still happening. People who are even living in, say, for example, old flats, which are almost like neighborhood, like in small cities. They are moving into those close gated big
Gated communities.
which are again
Also, there are a lot of social processes which are in place, and those we cannot still make as the kind of that social change. But as far as the cities are concerned, what do we value?
I am making a simple plea to question the value base of our imagination about our cities. That's the point. It's not about, we don't have to go back to the nostalgia of living in those places. We don't have to go back there. But what are we replacing it with? What is the value that we are leaving behind? I am talking about just the built fabric. Social change is another factor, and social change and is a reflection of the built fabric. In fact, you had also said in your presentation, actually what we call the external environment and our internal environment, which is our culture, are a continuum. It is one and the same thing. You have on one end of the spectrum the external environment, on the other what we call culture, which is our internal environment. And if you change the external environment, the internal environment will change, or vice versa. You change your internal environment, you will immediately find changes coming into the external environment. So, once we understand these basic principles, then we can locate our values in the place where our consciousness of as a society is currently located. Are we in a position to articulate that? Those are questions we are not asking. That is the problem. We are talking about financial models. I am not saying we should not have financial models. We should have them.